There are two ways to manage your paddocks. The Manage Paddocks button will bring up a complete list of paddocks that can be sorted or filtered. Alternatively, you can right-click on individual paddocks on the map. Right-clicking on a paddock on the map will show you a summary of information about that paddock, including your most recent pasture assessment, target, and other settings for that paddock. The grazing history will show you a list of all the mobs that have grazed that paddock and the grazing duration. To view or edit the pasture settings for the paddock, go to Pasture and Irrigation. A list of previously entered pasture records will be shown under the Modify Parameters tab, and you can edit an existing record if you've made a mistake, or create a new record to update information about that paddock. If you have just created a paddock and are entering information for the first time, you'll need to check every setting. If you are entering a new record for an existing paddock, you only need to change the settings that you want to update. The total area of the paddock is calculated automatically, but you can also enter your own values if needed. The grazable area of the paddock is the area that grows pasture, so any creeks or heavily timbered areas where pasture does not grow will need to be excluded. Entering the percent of grazable area will automatically update this grazable area in hectares. Next, you need to describe the approximate percentage of pasture species that are temperate versus tropical or subtropical on average across the year. Temperate pasture species begin to grow in autumn, continue throughout winter, and produce most feed in spring before slowing down or haying off over summer. This category includes species like barleygrass, phalaris, and lucerne. Tropical and subtropical pastures start growing in spring, produce most feed in summer, and continue through to autumn before slowing down or frosting off. This category includes species like annual panic grasses, kikuyu, and redgrass. Click on the blue info button for further information about these categories and examples of pasture types for each one. There are also some links that will take you to external websites if your pasture species aren't listed here. You now need to describe the productivity of that pasture for both your temperate and your tropical or subtropical species. Pasture productivity is the combination of pasture growth rate, the amount of green leaf, the digestibility of the pasture, and pasture density. A high productivity setting reflects pastures that are highly digestible, predominantly green, and quite dense. An example of this might be a well-maintained ryegrass and clover paddock with a very high level of ground cover and very little dead material. A low productivity setting reflects a pasture that has a larger area of bare ground, poorer quality pasture species, and a larger proportion of dead standing pasture. The correct productivity setting will depend on your unique situation, and you may need to adjust this setting a couple of times when you first start using Ag360. If you find that Ag360 is frequently overestimating the amount of pasture available, then your productivity setting could be set too high. Likewise, if Ag360 is underestimating how much pasture is available, then your productivity setting could be set too low. If that's the case, you'll need to come back into your pasture information for this paddock and adjust your productivity slider accordingly. Productivity needs to be set for both the temperate species and the tropical subtropical species. Current pasture availability describes the amount of pasture that would be available if you were to cut it down to ground level. The target is the amount of pasture that you want to have by a certain date. You can set targets to avoid overgrazing paddocks or to make sure that you have enough feed on hand to get through low pasture growth periods. Soil fertility can be entered using an overall fertility slider setting, or you can enter soil test results in the fertility calculator. Changing the sliders in the fertility calculator will automatically update the overall fertility slider position. A low value means that pasture growth is limited by one or more major soil chemical restrictions, whereas high means that there are no soil chemical restrictions to pasture growth. Finally, enter the main soil type for your paddock and save your settings. Targets can be managed by going to the Pasture Targets tab, where you can edit existing targets or add new targets. You can have multiple targets for the same paddock on different dates. All of these functions can also be accessed by going to the Manage Paddocks button, and you can also rename paddocks here if needed.